Hello, everybody. Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well and avoiding the malevolence of microbes. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We are beaming to you from Ramaytush Ohlone land, where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love, with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the summer season and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. This evening, we are delighted to have with us again Brian Evenson, celebrating the release of his new short fiction collection, compellingly titled The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell. It is published by our friends over at Coffee House Press. This latest collection wows us with its dark and very riveting storytelling. It showcases craftsmanship of a really adept writer. So these are some breathtaking stories, and City Lights is really honored to have Brian grace our virtual halls once again. I think you're really going to enjoy this book. Brian Evenson is the author of over a dozen works of fiction. He has received 3 O. Henry Prizes for his work. His most recent book, Song for the Unraveling of the World, won a Shirley Jackson Award and was a finalist for both the Los Angeles Times Ray Bradbury Prize and the Balcones Fiction Prize. He makes his home in Los Angeles and teaches at CalArts. And joining him tonight in conversation is Sarah Rose Etter. Sarah Rose Etter is the author of Tongue Party and the Book of X, her first novel, which is the winner of the 2019 Shirley Jackson Award. Her work has appeared in Guernica, Bomb, Gulf Coast, The Cut, Vice, and several other outlets. She has been awarded residencies at the Jack Kerouac House, the Disquiet International Program in Portugal, and the Gulkistan Writing Residency in Iceland. So please join us now in giving a warm welcome to Brian Evenson and Sarah Rose Etter. Welcome both to City Lights Live.
Hello.
Thank you. Hi.
Yeah.
I think I'm just going to start by reading, and then Sarah and I will have a little bit of a conversation. I'm, as Pete mentioned, I'm Brian Evenson. This is the book that I've just published, The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, which my 8-year-old son thinks I should call The Glassy Burning Floor of Heck, because he finds that less offensive. But it's what it is, so we're just going to leave it as it is. It's a pleasure to be here. If you don't know City Lights as a bookstore, it's an amazing bookstore in San Francisco. They're also a publisher and have done some wonderful things. I'd really encourage you to check out some of the work that they've published. They've done, they did a book by Caribbean Fragoso this last year, which I think is really amazing. They've done just all sorts of things over the years that are really wonderful. But I'm going to start by just reading the first story of this book, which is called Leg. And it's kind of a weird, almost futuristic fairy tale. So this is Leg. The captain of the vessel was named Hecla, a name that in the language of her ancestors meant cloak, though she had never worn a cloak. One of her legs was not a leg at all, but a separate creature that had learned to act like a leg. When she needed to walk about her vessel, this served as a leg for her. But once she was alone in her quarters, she would unstrap it and it would unfurl to become a separate being, something she could converse with, a trusted advisor, a secret friend. Nobody knew it to be other than an artificial leg except for her. Hecla had found the leg before she became captain, a few moments after she lost her flesh and blood leg, severed cleanly mid-thigh in a freak accident. Hecla had the presence of mind to tourniquet what was left of her thigh. She was fading from consciousness, having lost too much blood when it appeared. It was bipedal, but strange and glittering, made of angles and light. Each time Hecla looked at it, it seemed subtly different. "What is that?" asked the creature. "What?" Hecla managed. "The dark substance puddling around you." "That is my blood," said Hecla. "I will soon die." "Ah," said the creature. "You don't exist," claimed Hecla. "I'm hallucinating you." The creature ignored this. Instead, it said, "Would you not prefer to live?" And with this began a relationship that bound Hecla and Leg tightly together. "I'm bored," she told the Leg one day, many years later, once she was captain of the vessel. "We do nothing but float. I want something exciting to do." The Leg told her this. On the winds of the darkness is a creature as long as this vessel, that moves in a slow, undulating pattern across the currents of space. Its back is quivered with spines, and it is long and thin like a snake, but has the head and metal-breaking bill of a bony fish. With a swipe of its tail, it could destroy this vessel. Why do you tell me this, Leg? She asked. Leg shrugged. It is a worthy foe. I thought you might like to hunt it. At first, Hecla dismissed Leg's suggestion out of hand. It made no sense to endanger her crew and the passengers sleeping in the storage pods for her own amusement. But as the days dragged past, she began to favor the idea. Eventually, she listened to the Leg with interest. When it told her where such a creature was most likely to be found, she directed the navigator to change their course. Why should I change course, he asked. His name was Michael. Because I'm your captain, said Hecla, and I tell you to do so. We have a destination, said Michael. A new life awaits us. Change course, said Hecla. I will not do so without a reason, said Michael. So Hecla explained. That is not a worthy reason, said Michael, once she had finished. If you do this thing, many of us will die, perhaps even all of us. No, I will not alter our course. We shall continue to our intended destination. The captain asked again, and again he refused. In the end, he made it clear that she would have her way only if she killed him first. She returned to her quarters, muttering to herself, what use is it to be captain if I cannot have my way? Once back in her quarters, she released her Leg. It unfurled and revealed itself. Did you hear him, Leg? She asked. The Leg simply inclined its head, for as curious as it seems, the Leg, when unfurled, had a head to indicate that it had. Who is the captain? Asked the Leg in its strange voice. Is it not you? It is indeed me, said Hecla. Then force him to do it, the Leg said. He claims he would rather die first, said Hecla. Then oblige him. But the captain did not want to kill Michael herself. She knew it was wrong and that she would feel guilty doing so. And yet, perhaps if she were not the one to do the actual killing, it would not be as wrong as she would be able to live with, not be as wrong, and she would be able to live with what had been done. The only one she could trust to kill Michael and keep her involvement a secret was Leg. Leg, she said. Hecla, said Leg, bowing deeply. Will you kill Michael for me? Yes, said Leg. Here is what we will do. You will go to the navigation center when he is alone, and he will secure the door from within. When he asks you what you are doing, you will ignore him and release me, and I will unfurl and kill him. I do not want to be there when he dies, said Hecla. I do not want to see it or for anyone to guess I am involved. Find another way. Leg thought. Take me off in your room. Then I will unfurl, walk down the corridor, enter the navigation center, and kill him. People will see you walking and see what you are, and they will shriek and scream. No one must know I have you, Leg. If they realize you are more than a Leg, they will destroy you, and perhaps me as well. Think again, Leg. Leg thought long. I will change myself, said Leg finally. I will take on your countenance, and in that guise, I will kill him. Can you do that? Asked Hecla, amazed. Can you become just like me? Yes, and act like you too, but only if you grant me permission. And so Hecla did. As she watched, Leg underwent a transformation, taking on first her height and figure, and then the specifics of her features. In the end, there was nothing to tell the two of them apart, except that the captain was missing her prosthetic, and Leg, in becoming captain, had thought to give itself what seemed to be an artificial leg. When Hecla looked upon this perfect replication of herself, a shiver ran through her. Go, she said, kill him. I go, said Leg, and left. Leg went through the door and into the passageway. It walked slowly toward the navigation center where Michael was. This was the first time it had been out of the captain's quarters on its own. This was the first time it had been away from the captain since Leg had found her. Leg enjoyed how this felt. Leg arrived at this navigation center. Michael was there, alone. It's no use trying to convince me, said Michael. I won't change my mind. I'm not going to try to convince you, said Leg, and killed him. To do this, Leg turned itself inside out and engulfed him so that the blood, when it came spattering forth, would be hidden inside. Then Leg released the exsanguinated body and turned itself right side out again. Inside, it was spattered with Michael's blood. On the outside, the false Hecla looked clean and untouched. And so Leg killed Michael and left his body on the floor. Then it bent over the body and stared at it long and hard. Slowly, it took on the shape and form of Michael, for once someone was dead, Leg did not need their permission to become them. Leg went back to the captain. At first, she thought it was Michael, since Michael was whom it resembled. The captain drew back as Leg came closer, afraid, until the moment Michael's features began to smooth out and Leg became itself again. Then it folded up tightly and became her leg again, though now it was a slosh inside with the dead man's blood. Wherever the captain walked, she heard it. And after? Some believe that, once Michael was dead, Leg was satisfied to remain as it was, hidden, the captain's confidant. Others believe Leg acquired a taste for being human and did not want to give this up. At night, while the captain slept, it would take on her form or that of Michael and wander the ship. Occasionally, as a special treat, it would turn itself inside out and kill someone, then dispose of the body, at times jettisoning it into space, at others incinerating it with the mechanism incorporated into its body. There are those who say that by the time the vessel reached the vast creature Hecla intended to hunt, Leg had destroyed the crew manning the vessel, and many of the passengers suspended in the storage pods. Only the captain and Leg were left awake and alive, and soon the ship was destroyed and the captain killed. And Leg? Soon it reached its mature form and became snake-bodied with the head of a bony fish, as it had always been meant to do. It is no doubt out there still, swimming alone along a current of darkness.
Love that last line. Thank you for that reading.
You're welcome.
Gorgeous. I'm so excited to talk to you tonight. Thanks for having me, first of all, and also congratulations. If anyone out there hasn't picked up this collection yet, now's a great time to support City Lights and Brian as well. The great thing about talking to Brian tonight is his work just keeps getting better. So I'm really excited to dive in. I wanted to talk off first just to find out a little bit about how the collection began for you.
Sure.
A few of the stories you had been working on, and I just wanted to find out how it came together and came into shape for you.
I mean, that's a good question. I think that often when I'm working on a collection, I don't know that I'm working on a collection until I've written about half the stories or sometimes 2/3 of the stories. And then after a while, I start to see certain stories talking to one another and communicating. And slowly I start to get a sense of a collection. And then kind of at that point, when I'm about 2/3 done, usually, I begin to write stories that kind of are meant to continue that conversation that the other stories are having. So certain themes keep coming up and things like that. So it is with this one. There's a couple of stories in here that are older than even like a Collapse of Horses. So they're stories from like 2013 or 14. But most of the stories were written kind of after Song for the Unraveling of the World, my latest book. And so it was just a question of finding what went together. And in fact, there's stories that were written at the same time that I saved for a later book as well. So it's very much, I'm trying to curate the book and make it feel like it's satisfying as a book, as well as individual stories. And you can, of course, just read the stories randomly if you want, but I hope that if you read the stories kind of in order, that you'll start to feel that it's more than just the sum of its parts.
Yeah, I know that you've said before that you hope that a collection would be read all the way through, sort of like the way you listen to an album.
Yeah.
So I was curious, or how you used to listen to an album at least.
Right, exactly.
I was going to ask, and this is jumping ahead a little, kind of what some of your favorite collections are to read straight through.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, there are, so this year, so one thing I do often is once I read a kind of best of someone, I'll go back and read the individual collections, because I feel like that you often find things that are different. And so I guess one of the recent things I read, there was a New York Review of Books put out an edition of Anna Kavan's stories, which is called Machines in the Head. Which is kind of a selection of stories. And I'd read Asylum Piece, which is an early collection of hers, but I'd never read a book of hers called A Bright Green Field. And there were just 2 stories in there from that. And they just made me so curious because they were different enough from other pieces I'd read by her, And so I managed finally, after a lot of effort, to track this book down, which has been out of print for, I don't know, 30, 40 years, and read it kind of together. And there is something really satisfying just about, the way in which those stories are kind of moving from one to the other. And it's not that it's not nice to read best of. I mean, if you read a best of, you kind of get the best of someone's work. But at the same time, it's like there's something about just the context. And so I've been doing that with different writers who I'm kind of interested in, often writers from the 30s and 40s who have been kind of lost, who I've just come across a collection of theirs. William Sampson is another one. Sansom, excuse me. He's a British writer. And at this point, you can get a kind of, a best of his stories, but there's a lot of stories that are not in that are really interesting. So I've been kind of tracking down individual volumes and reading them. And then another person who I kind of talk about at the end of the book is Algernon Blackwood, who I taught The Willows, which is a story that a lot of people know. It's kind of a really kind of a masterpiece of really kind of refined, suggestive horror. And I'd read a few other stories of his, but I'd never kind of gone back and looked at the individual collections. And I started doing that this year and found all these stories that I just really loved. And so I mean, I guess that's what it is as much as anything, is just, there's these stories that are maybe not, people don't qualify them as the best stories of a writer, but they still, I mean, taste is subjective. And often they're ones that suggest these paths that kind of go in directions that maybe even the writer didn't end up pursuing. And so with Blackwood, I think sometimes something he'll do in a story that's not very well known will kind of suggest things for me for my own fiction.
So when we talk about creating, a story collection one would read all the way through, what does laying that out look like for you? Are you kind of like laying each one out on the ground? Are you looking for a rhythm?
Yeah, I mean, it is like, it's very kind of like manual. I mean, I am kind of like printing everything out and laying it on the ground and then putting them in stacks on the floor until, when we had a cat, our cat would just get in the way and just lie on them. Eventually, and I just kind of move the stacks and think about the relationship of the stories to one another. And then eventually I'll have a kind of order and I'll put them together. And then at that point, often I'll think, oh, I need a couple other stories. And then I wait for those stories to come and kind of fill them in. And then sometimes, I mean, it's once I have them in an order, when I kind of sit down and read them, I realize, this story is too close to this other story. These stories are too close to one another and one needs to go somewhere else. And, with later volume, or, there's stories I've never collected in volumes, but it is really kind of hands-on, putting things on the floor, trying to decide what the order is. And of course, I mean, there's all sorts of different ways through a collection, but still, I mean, there's something, about, hopefully there's a path that goes through this one.
Yeah, certainly. There certainly is. You touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to dig in a little bit more. There are a lot of running themes to these stories, like ghosts, dome cities. Even we have like names repeated, right? Like Hecla makes an appearance at the beginning and the end. So I want to talk a little bit more about how much of that is like writerly intuition and how much of that is stepping back and kind of using that editing brain to pull those threads out.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of that's writerly intuition. There's definitely a lot of ghost stories in here, even though there are sometimes weird versions of ghost stories. And I don't know why there's so many dome cities in here, but there's a lot of, there's several stories. I guess there's at least 3 or something that have dome cities in it, maybe even more. And there's just something about my engagement with this particular moment that seems to make me imagine, maybe we're going to have to live someday in giant dome cities, I suppose. But so yeah, these things start to come up. There's stories that are about, what it means to be human or kind of beyond human, post-human. There's a kind of ecological horror thread that goes through some of these stories as well. And all those things, I mean, hopefully are kind of conversing with one another in various ways. And then, yeah, I think what happens is I'll start to get a few stories and start to feel a kind of impulse towards something. And then that I think just my subconscious mind will start to will notice. My conscious mind notices that, and then my subconscious mind starts to work on it and figures out the missing piece and finds another story that kind of starts to make a little bit more of the connections. So in this collection, you mentioned, I mean, the last story, it also someone named Hecla appears, may or may not be the same Hecla. I mean, I don't, you know, there's weird connections and kind of very bizarre connections in some ways. But yeah, I wrote the first story, Leg, and then when I was writing the Glassy, the title story, Glassy and Burning Floor of Hell, there was just a moment where I named the character Hecla, and I have these kind of moments where I think, all right, you know, can I get away with this? It's like something is kind of compelling me to do this, and you know, it may be a good thing or a bad thing. But in that case, it was like as soon as I kind of almost unintentionally done that, it opened up a whole avenue in terms of how I could think about the relationship of the first story to the last story.
I always refer to it as kind of my writer's OCD. Like I need things to be a certain way, you know, or
Yeah.
I'll be upset. Like if things don't even out some way.
Yeah.
I did want to talk a little bit about the title as well. I noticed that both the title and the final story have the same title, and it comes from a Margaret Young novel.
Yeah.
Adaptation, My Darling. And I know it's a very experimental text, and you tend to reference other texts in your work. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about what inspired you from that novel.
Yeah, I mean, so if you don't know it, which I think it's not a very well-known novel at this point, Miss Mackintosh, My Darling is this gigantic novel. It's about, I don't know how many words, but it's about 1,200 pages long, depending on the edition you have, and two volumes, may even be a little longer than that, to be honest. And it's something I've carried around for a long time. Dalkey Archive republished it a few years ago, and maybe 10 years ago now, 15 years ago, maybe even longer than that. And I've just had it for a long time. And so actually there's a critic named Steve Shaviro who's on Facebook as well. And Steve decided that he'd read it years ago and decided to reread it and do a kind of reading guide to it. And I just got kind of involved in that. And I thought, you know, if ever there's going to be a time when I read this novel, it's going to be now. And so I just kind of followed him through and you know, read what he was saying about it and read the novel as well. And it's a really amazing novel, and you know, very complex, kind of innovative and experimental in a way, the same way that someone like James Joyce is, but also just inflected really differently. And that idea of you know, a woman doing this incredibly maximalist book, you know, people generally think of that as like men's territory, even though there's been plenty of women who have done these amazing kind of maximalist novels, and Margaret Young is one of them. And you know, there's Ellman, who wrote, I'm forgetting her first name, but Ducks Newburyport is another one. And there's plenty kind of along the way. And so it just, I just, when I was reading that, it's so much about what's real and what's not real that I really felt connected to it, because so much of my work is about that. And then I just ran across this line, which is a throwaway line. It doesn't have anything to do with the kind of themes of the book or anything, but someone talks about the glassy, burning floors of hell. And I was just like, yes, this is what I need. and so that was the inspiration for that final story and for the collection as a whole. So, but yeah, she's really terrific, great nonfiction writer as well as a great fiction writer. Has done things, and yeah, as Paul mentions in the chat, the biography of Eugene Debs biography isn't finished.
Great, we're gonna have to check that out when I hunt it down.
Yeah, you have to be at like in a place where you have nothing to do for like a month, and then you can read through it and enjoy it.
Unfortunately, I think I might have that time on my hands too.
Yeah.
You know, I also noticed beyond just that book, you know, often your work is engaging with like a larger philosophy, and I wasn't sure what kind of maybe philosophy and research might have tied into these stories for you, if there were anything besides.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like I'm always, you know, I do think a lot about just the way the mind works, and that's something that's part of these stories. I'm interested in the way that people interpret reality and the kind of differences of that. And you have these kind of, you know, reality tunnels is a term that gets used by Thomas Metzinger. to talk about that, and just this notion of the contingency of reality too. So I mean, I think a lot of my work in terms of kind of like the philosophical underpinnings of it, it's about, what can we know, what can we really know, and the degree to which we can kind of really engage with the world that's there, and the degree to which we're actually engaging with a kind of edited representation of our world that our mind has created for us. And we're very good at selectively ignoring certain things. And I've talked about this before, but I had this experience years ago when I was walking across a parking lot late at night, and I saw this bird on the other side of the parking lot. It wasn't late at night; it was kind of near dusk actually, but I saw a bird on the other side of the parking lot, and it was moving really strangely. Even from a distance, it just seemed really weird to me. And so I kind of walked towards it, and I just kept thinking, maybe it's hurt, or maybe it's protecting its young, and there's a predator nearby, and it's trying to kind of, distract it. And it wasn't until I was about, 10 or 15 feet away that I realized it was not a bird at all, but a leaf being blown about by the wind. And so I'd had this experience where I had, I had an experience with a bird that wasn't there, but it was like a real experience at the same time. And I think so much of our kind of the way in which we kind of interact with the world is about these moments of kind of misapprehension that still are an experience for us. And so that's something I think I circle back to a lot, just the way in which we misperceive our uncertainty about reality. And, and how do you, once you start feeling reality is kind of slippery, how do you kind of keep your balance? How do you keep going?
Yeah, because as you're on your way across the parking lot, it's very real, right? And your body is believing we're going to have to go deal with this and fix this.
Right, right, exactly.
And so for this like suspended moment, you're preparing yourself to deal with this thing that's not real at all.
Right, yeah. I'm interacting with a world that's not there, but I'm interacting with it in a real way. And I think, and sometimes that's really obvious how we do that, but I think also, so often our beliefs and our way of thinking about the world and everything kind of position us to see certain things about the world and to see them in a particular way. And, you can think about this in regard to politics and things like that, I think that probably a Republican's brain and Democrats' brain work very differently when they're hearing the same speech. But trying to think about, all right, if we can acknowledge that there is this contingency that's part of human experience, then how do we live with that, and how do we also acknowledge it's contingent? How can we kind of realize that we're that we're the ground beneath our feet is a little bit unstable?
One thing that also just jumped out to me, there were a few more stories in this collection that felt like they were dealing with much more global elements and sort of the end of the world, apocalypse. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the movement toward that, and are we more doomed now, and that's why you're writing these stories, or have we always been doomed?
Well, I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think we probably are more doomed now, but I don't know for sure. It feels that way. I mean, I think we're more conscious of the fact that things are problematic than maybe we were before. And when you see kind of weather events and forest fires in California and all these things kind of coming together, and the danger of kind of reaching kind of intense wet bulb temperatures in undeveloped nations, all those things I think end up making me quite concerned, as I think most rational people are. But it's funny. I mean, I feel like when I was growing up as a kid, I grew up in Utah, and I remember, when I was pretty young, the moment where there were gas lines, where it seemed like gasoline was running out, and people would line up, and you could only get gas on even or odd days. And my parents are on, and they may correct me in terms of the exact specifics of that. And I remember just the kind of intensity of that, and kind of growing up, in my, and really thinking of the way in which, I just thought, things are going crazy, things are kind of ending. We're going to have to figure out something else. And various movies like Damnation Alley that seem to be focusing on that, and Soylent Green. And then suddenly, what happened was Reagan was elected, and it was like everybody just forgot. It was like, oh, everything's okay again. And I think as a kid, I was just incredibly suspicious of that. It just seemed like, we had this kind of awareness that we were kind of deliberately pushing under the rug. And so in a way that the kind of awareness of climate change and the awareness of the potential scarcity of resources that seem to be coming up, it just feels to me like we're returning to a place that I think we never really left. But it's just, it feels very conscious now. And I do feel, there are stories that I think of as ecological horror stories in this that are very much about, the potential end of the world and what do we do? And there is this thing, it's not very polite to say, but the whole world would probably be better off if humans died out.
I was going to say this is one of my questions. There are quite a few lines here, like the world is hell because we have made it so, and here's how monstrous humans are, right? And so like, that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, right? Are we this awful and we need to go? And probably we are.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of people who are concerned about that, but it is like, I mean, we seem to have done damage to the world as our home in a way that other creatures haven't, part because of the way we've spread and the way that we've kind of used resources and things like that. And so, but at the same time, as someone who's human, I really prefer not to die out. But I think that, I think it's like I would really prefer that we start thinking pretty seriously about, how do we kind of go to the next step. And it's like, I think one of the problems is now we see billionaires who are all flying on rockets. And, it seems like, from the outside, they're figuring out ways to leave.
Yeah.
And they're gonna leave and leave us stuck here. Or, the idea that, oh, maybe we can just fix it by one of the plans to kind of improve the climate is to inject sulfur into the atmosphere. And maybe that will help, but that also sounds like a really bad idea in other ways. And so, it's complicated, but I think that just kind of trying to talk about, the problematics of this is a good thing.
I was thinking that the other day. I was reading about somewhere where they needed rain so badly they were using drones to shoot the clouds to make the rain come out, and I'm like, there has to be a backlash to that. Like,
Yeah,
it can't be that simple that like we're just gonna force it to rain and nothing bad's gonna come of it.
right. Yeah, or like Matt Bell's book that he just published, Appleseed. It's like there's these kind of robotic bees that are replacing actual bees, and there's problematic things with that. So yeah.
I was thinking too, when you were talking about growing up and kind of having this sense of like the end times then too, your work always, it feels like there's always kind of a danger at the edges sometimes where, we're not always looking directly at it. And it's something that I really like about your work, but I could also see that kind of carrying through a whole life, right? If your whole life you're kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, it kind of makes sense that the work would do the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's true. It's like, I mean, a lot of my characters, I think, are very deliberately not thinking about certain things, and that I think is true for a lot of the book. But there's a character in a story which is called the Curator, who's thinking very directly about one person, what can I do in a very particular role, and makes a decision, which is a kind of almost catastrophic decision, but has a very ethical reason to make it, even if I don't know. I mean, I think that's a story that I don't know. I'm interested in her. I don't know that I agree with her completely.
That's one of my favorite stories in the collection. It is asking a lot of questions or forcing you to ask some questions that are really interesting. I feel like I don't want to spoil it for everybody.
Yeah, it's probably for the best. Yeah.
We did have one question come in that I would like to ask. When you're writing, do you favor novels or short stories?
I favor short stories, and I think it's just because I mean, I'm one of those lucky writers who has more ideas than he or she can possibly write about. And that's that's good in some ways. And so short stories gives me a chance to kind of explore these things. And it seems like every time I write a story, it raises an idea for another half of a story or something. And so I feel like for me, this story is just there's lots of possibilities in terms of what stories can do. And I like novels. I mean, I think every once in a while I come across. I mean, I like reading novels, and every once in a while I come across an idea that just really demands that space. And so I approach it in that way. So, yeah.
I think you've spoken before in the past about this idea of the baggy novel, which like haunts
Yeah.
me. Because if you're in the middle of writing a novel and you hear the phrase baggy novel, you're like, oh no.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't mean to.
No, it's good. It's
Yeah.
helpful. But I would love if you could talk a little bit more about that. Like maybe the novel gives some people too much space.
Well, I mean, I think it can. I mean, Bakhtin talks about the novel as a baggy monster, he calls it. And for him, that's a real big plus, because he feels like what you can do is you can just take everything and just dump it into the novel and shake it up, and it ends up being kind of an interesting thing. And I think to some degree that's true, but you know, at the same time, you know, it can be baggy. You know, I think one thing about short stories is if you read a novel and a chapter doesn't work all that well, then you just go on to the next chapter and you're probably going to be okay. If too many in a row don't work, then you get frustrated. But if you, you know, with a short story, people I think are much more demanding of just it working kind of, and they expect more just because, I mean, sometimes when you're reading a novel, you're reading it over multiple days and you forget parts of it, things like that. Whereas a short story, you can kind of read in one setting. For me, my favorite form, I probably have said this before too, is the novella, because I feel like it has a little bit more breadth than the short story does, but can still be very tight and very compressed and very compact and very language conscious. So it can demand a lot of the reader, but can also kind of, you know, has a little more philosophical reach or something.
I love that. We do have one question that sounds like someone is asking a greedy question. Any update on the Last Days sequel?
So I have a novel which is called Last Days, which is about an amputation cult. So just, you know, light reading. And I have, I think it's about 108 pages of that written. And it's going a little slower than I want it to go, partly because I've been doing various other sorts of things. But I definitely have that in mind. It's something that I feel like I'm going towards. And initially I thought, you know, it was weirder than Last Days, but then I reread Last Days and realized that was pretty weird. And so it's probably just about as weird rather than weirder. But it is, you know, it's coming along, and I feel like I'm done with the first 2 sections, and I've just started the 3rd section, which to me is going to be the final section. And there's a kind of, you know, I don't know, I don't want to say too much about it, but it introduces kind of new weirder cults and things like that as well. And, you know, the same character who's in the first one. So we'll see. I mean, I'm hoping by December I'll have that done. But it depends on just other commitments and what else goes on.
It's brave of you to say a month because everyone's really excited. So maybe that's a good way to be held accountable, though. You know, I did also want to talk, you've been working really hard a little bit more in both like the film and, you know, screenplay space and the graphic novel space. So I was curious,
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, how do you get it all done? But then second of all, how are they kind of maybe informing the stories and the fiction work?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, that can be, they can all feed each other is what I think. But at the same time, you know, since I teach as well, anything I do in addition is going to take time away from either sleep or from writing. And so that's hard. I've been working on a TV show. I'm a staff writer for a limited series TV show, which is called The Sun, which is Jake Gyllenhaal is kind of slated to star on that, and Denis Villeneuve is directing all 8 episodes of that. And that's been incredibly fun for me, just because it's really different than anything I've done before. It's like, it's really fun for me to be in this role of like learning stuff over again. And you know, it's been a blast, and the showrunner is just so good with that. But also, I mean, you know, on the other hand, it can be a distraction from my own writing. So it's hard for me to kind of get back into the Last Days sequel, which is called Phantom Limb. But I can write stories kind of while that's going on. So I've kind of been doing that just a little bit slower. And then I've done, you know, some other movie things. I did a script for Blumhouse, which is based on one of my stories. And you know, that's kind of in the limbo that you have things go on. And I did some other things here and there. So yeah.
We have another question that just came in. Since you've written an entire book on him, what are your favorite stories by Robert Coover?
I think Coover is a great writer, and really interesting writer. There's at least one person in the audience who's done some significant work on Coover as well. I am very fond of his early book of stories, which is called Prick Songs and Descants, probably because it was one of the first things I came across. But also, like, I think he's one of these writers who's been kind of consistently good over time. And so I like very much a late story of his called Going for a Beer, which is about a whole life kind of in this compressed space, just really wonderfully done. And then he's also done, I teach a fairy tale class here at CalArts a lot. And every single time I've taught a fairy tale class, which I think I've done 4 times at this point, I've taught at least something by Coover. And often I teach, there's a Briar Rose. He has a book called Briar Rose, which is a novella, which is based on the Sleeping Beauty tale, which is really just remarkably done. So yeah, someone posted Going for a Beer in the chat, so we can, if you want to read it. But yeah, I think it's hard to go wrong with Bob's work. I think he's really an interesting writer, and he's one of those rare people who is really capable of writing both short stories and novels. I think most writers seem to gravitate towards one or the others, but Bob just seems to kind of go back and forth with those. So
I did have another question in terms of revision, kind of the idea of, when is a story done for you?
Yeah.
Because I know
Yeah.
a couple of these you had been working on for a while, so I was just curious, kind of when do you hit the point where you say I've had enough, or
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes I'll reach a point with a story where I just keep on kind of making a change and then changing it back in the next draft, and that feels like it's done enough. I mean, one of the frustrating things is that sometimes you end up realizing what you should have done after. And then one of the great things about stories is it's like you can revise stories from magazine publication to book publication, which I've done a little bit of, not dramatically, but here and there I make little changes. Yeah, I mean, it's very tentative for me to feel like a story's done, but also I think that there's a point where I feel like I've done as much as I can do with this story, and maybe there's things about the story that suggest to me other sorts of stories or other possibilities. So sometimes it's just the kind of interest of moving on to something else. But yeah, it's hard to know sometimes, for sure. And I think it's harder with novels, to be honest, because it's like, you can endlessly revise a novel if you're not careful. I have a novel I worked on for 6 years, and that just about killed me. So.
Wow, that's such a long time, but actually that sounds like I'm calculating it in my head. I'm like, it's actually about right. We have some more questions come in. Who would be your ideal director for a film adaptation of your work?
That's a good question. I mean, there's so many people who are doing interesting work out there, and so it depends a little bit on what the work would be. I've sold lots of options on stuff, and so I mean, just really depends on something coming through. I don't know. I feel like I don't want to make other directors jealous. There's lots of good people. I think there's a director named Rick Alverson who I really like his work. I think he's doing some kind of interesting radical stuff. Denis Villeneuve is kind of amazing. I think his work is just does remarkable things. But there's just a lot of interesting directors out there. So I don't really think of it so much that way for whatever reason. Yeah. I'm going to dodge the question.
I was going to say, you're doing a great job of not answering that one. But we also had another one come in. The names you use in your stories are always unique. Where do you find the names that you use? Are you actively looking for them?
I do actively look for them. I collect those names. I mean, one of the funny things about the story Leg I just read to you is that there's the name Hecla, which is, of course, quite unique as a name, Scandinavian name. But also there's the name Michael. And Michael, just if you know the names in my fiction, they're often Germanic or Scandinavian and uncommon for an American ear. And so one of the weird things about that story is I think if you're reading it kind of in context of my other stories, Michael sounds weird just because it's not a name that really appears in my work much. But I mean, I actively look for them. I actually spend time on, anytime I find a name that's strange, I write it down and think about it, or a name that seems strange to me. And, I read enough that I kind of come across them sometimes. And sometimes I do actually go on name sites and think about it. And I find that once I name a character in a story, I almost never rename the story. And I think, I have a sister whose name is Bengta, Bengte, which is a very rare Swedish name, kind of a variant of the Swedish name. And I think maybe part of my interest in names comes from, I feel like so much of her personality is based on having this name that nobody else has. And so I think often it's like thinking about how a name kind of says something to the bearer of it, or to the reader in this case.
Yeah, it's like a signifier. It also it adds to the otherworldliness too.
Yeah.
I think a lot of your stories and a lot of your work, if you just had someone named Jess,
Yeah.
I don't know why, but no offense to any Jesses in the audience, it might take away some of that,
Right.
magic that's happening.
And I've wondered sometimes if I was to, if my stories get translated into Swedish, if they just like, these are totally normal names, and it's just a very different feeling.
Their version of him.
Yeah, and at least a couple of stories haven't, so I should ask the translator about that. Yeah.
Another question that just came in: who would you consider your major literary influences? We know that Robert Coover came up, but I don't know if you had anybody else in mind.
I mean, Coover was very important to me, and I wrote a book on Coover, and Jack mentioned that before in the chat, and I think just the act of writing about his work and thinking about it was really important for me. Even though I think we're different writers in some way, but I think we really respect each other a lot, and I think he's quite good. Other influences, I mean, I feel like there's different influences at different times. Early influences were Kafka and Beckett were incredibly important to me. And they came to me at kind of the right moment. And my father actually introduced me to Kafka, which was really useful. And then Beckett, I came across because we were reading the Zoo Story in high school. And in the note about Edward Albee's The Zoo Story, it mentioned Beckett. And I liked the Zoo Story enough that I went and found him and then just really liked him. So they were very important to me early on. There was a particular moment in my, maybe 20 or 30 years ago now, actually, that Cormac McCarthy was incredibly important and was very helpful in terms of shaping how I thought of what I could do. Paul Bowles has been really important as well. Flannery O'Connor was important. And weirdly enough, I mean, Muriel Spark was really important to me about 10 or 15 years ago. And she's so precise. I mean, I don't think she's someone you would ever think of in relation to my work, because she's somewhat different. But she's really precise, and all her work is quite different and quite distinct. And I just felt like I learned so much from the economy of what she does with things. And I wrote a book on Raymond Carver, and there was a certain moment where Carver was really important to me as well. So, and that kind of stripped down style was something that I wrestle with. Yeah, The Driver's Seat by Muriel Spark is quite good. And so she has The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, which I feel is kind of the perfect book. It's just really, really nicely done. And then The Driver's Seat is really, very sparse and very different, and just a whole different feel to it. And so it's just, for me, it's the aggregate of her work. Just, it's really good. It was Keith and Rosemary Waldrop in Providence introduced me to her work, and it kind of changed things for me in a nice way.
When you say precise, do you mean like the line work?
Yeah, the line work, and even things like how she kind of gets a character across, or how she, what she manages. She manages to do a lot with just a little. She has a novella that is not really well known, which is called Reality and Dreams, and I just think it's just stunningly done, just in terms of it's about someone who disappears, and it just the way in which that's kind of rendered is just really, really wonderfully done. But yeah, also people like Joy Williams has been important to me. And anyone who's kind of, doing, work that is conscious of language has been important. I mean, and then there's also the people on the genre side. I mean, Laird Barron's really important to me. And Robert Aikman, I talked about in the back of this book. He's probably, in terms of my kind of more recent books, they're the ones that are the most important. He's the one that's most important.
Would it be possible for you to comment on your relationship to surrealism and dark humor?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my work is funny, but in a very dark way. And there is that kind of game. I mean, Max Brod talks about Kafka reading his stories aloud and just laughing uproariously, which is not really the way we think of Kafka generally. But there is, there is something about these moments of humor, which I feel are in my work, which kind of are almost like a pressure release valve or something that kind of just change things a little bit. And then surrealism, I mean, was something that's important to me, and just kind of fantastical literature in general. Absurdist theater and surrealism were really important to me when I was young too. When I was growing up, there was a little used bookstore kind of near a thrift shop in Utah, in Provo, which I think was Walt West Books. I get confused about which store it was. And they just had all sorts of Grove Press editions for $1 each. And once I'd kind of gone through all their Beckett, I started going on to Ionesco and Chenet and Arabal and all sorts of other people. And so that kind of absurdist strand of theater and then surrealism as well, I think have been really important to me. Artaud was really important to me at one point, for instance.
How old were you when you were doing
I was probably 18 or 19, I guess. It was like my first year of college, and yeah, it was. So Beckett I found kind of when I was a senior in high school, and and to be honest, my friend and I who were reading Beckett, I don't know that we had a really good grasp of him. It was just like we were reading him and no one else was, and that was exciting to us. But as time's gone on, I think he's just really fed me as a writer. So yeah.
Do you feel, I feel like your work just keeps getting stronger, and I don't want to say more effortless because obviously it's always work, but do you feel that, like going from writing when you were younger, like more books that you write, does it get a little bit easier?
It doesn't necessarily get easier, but it gets, some things get easier and some things don't, I guess, is what I would say. And I'm very happy with this book. I feel like the last couple of books I feel like have really come together as books, and I feel like I've figured out ways to do that a little bit more. So if you start with this book and read backwards, you'll just be more and more disappointed.
That is not true.
No, I know. But yeah, I feel like it's not that it gets easier, but I feel like I understand more of the relationship between different stories and stuff, and how to make those subtle relationships. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm happy with the way this book came out, and I hope that any of you who read it are too.
It's amazing. I love this book so much, and I really enjoyed getting a chance to talk to you about it. Does anyone else have any last questions? Just want to do one last call out for it.
I'll mention too that Sarah has her The Book of X is really a wonderful book, which won the Shirley Jackson Award last year as well.
Thanks, that's so sweet. Thank you. And this is a great collection, and I was really glad to get to talk to you about it.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Well, that is all we have time for. But Brian, congratulations. Sarah, thank you so much for being such a thoughtful and really awesome interviewer. Really appreciate the both of you gracing our virtual halls.
Much.
Good night. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.